especially in our culture, we think of this sin with Bathsheba, and oftentimes when we hear the story of David and Bathsheba taught, we hear the sin described as adultery. You're very clear in the book that you see the power dynamics along with the verbs that are used as indicating that this sin is more accurately defined as rape. So, can you explain why rape is a more accurate term than adultery?
Yeah, this is a little, I'll give you, peel back the curtain a little bit in process of writing a book. Because if I had a Substack or a blog or whatever, I could write stuff, it could get published, maybe it'd be helpful. But one of the blessings of writing a book is there's a whole bunch of eyes on it and they challenge the author. And so I wrote the book, I wrote my first manuscript, and then I said it's too long. So I cut 10,000 words out of it, which is a lot because I wanted to be accessible and I wanted to trim some of the flab. I wanted to really streamline and be accessible. And then I, I sent it out to 10 friends of various levels of education and reading and said, I'd love your feedback. And they're like, oh no, I'm not qualified. I don't have a Bible college education. I'm like, that's exactly why I want you to tell me what you think.
Yes.
And or friends with PhDs, and they might have insights that I didn't notice. And
Hmm.
so 10 friends graciously read the manuscript and got back to me. Then you know um rework in light of feedback and say, man, that was a blind spot, I missed that. Send it to the publisher as my final draft, and it takes 15 months between final manuscript submission and publication. you know
Hmm.
Book in the
Yeah.
hands months. And the first thing the publisher did was send it out to a peer reviewer and a reader. And the peer reviewer is an expert in the field, so someone who's a peer of the
Hmm.
author that can read it as a scholar and give critique. And here's what I found helpful. Here's what I want to critique. The reader, in this case, I wanted it to be an accessible book. So we wanted someone without expertise to read it, and they gave impressions. And my editor at IVP, Rachel Hastings, gave her impressions. And
Hmm.
I had all that. And I had the word adultery in my first manuscript. So
Mm.
here's me coming clean.
Yeah.
And I'm doing another project right now on Samuel. And so I was working through Samuel in Hebrew, just translating it, doing inductive notes, getting ready for this project, when the peer reviewers' comments got back to me and they blasted me for using the word adultery.
Mm.
But I had just translated 1 Samuel 11 for this other project. And I had
Mm.
just noticed that the verbs there were David saw, David sent, David took, David had sex with. And
Mm.
I think he sent away again. I forget. But there's all the
Mhm.
verbs are David as the aggressor. He's acting. And then in the context, Bathsheba is someone who's in the kingdom and David as the king. There's a power dynamic there. She wouldn't have had a choice. And so I pulled back from the language of adultery, and I'm very thankful for that correction from the peer reviewer. I think that this person, I don't know who they were. It's a blind peer review process, so I don't know
Mhm.
who they were, but thank you because I want to handle God's word accurately.
Mhm.
Now, this person used the word rape, and I left it in there. I put it in there in one iteration of my corrections. And then as we sent it out to endorsers, one of the endorsers challenged me on that word rape. And I looked at it
Mm.
again, and I think it's definitely more than adultery because David is the aggressor and there's a power dynamic. But the text, when you read the story in 2 Samuel 11, the text doesn't comment at all on whether
Mhm.
Bathsheba is willing or unwilling.
Mhm.
You get Amnon and Tamar later clearly rape. Oh no, my brother,
Mhm.
don't do, and it's
Mhm.
clearly rape. She doesn't want it, and he is the aggressor, and it's just a horrible scene of rape. But in 2 Samuel 11, I want to be as faithful to God's word as I can. And I want to let the story. So I pulled back from using the actual word rape. And
Mm.
I think I used something. Do you remember the language I used? It was something along the lines of horrendous sexual sin or something like that, or horrendous sin against Bathsheba and Uriah, whom he murdered, which is clearly murder. So that's why it's more than adultery, but I can't say whether it's was rape or whether it was consensual, because the text just doesn't tell me. But I want David to bear the responsibility as the aggressor in the power dynamic. So I was tap dancing, Tim, really trying to be very careful in my language.
Yeah. So there's so many things there. I appreciate very much your heart of wanting to accurately describe what's going on.
Hmm.
And it reminds me of something that I can so appreciate even about the editorial process. And this is a helpful thing. I hadn't intended to talk about this, but you brought it up. And in terms of scholarship, I think most lay people have a vision of, scholars sitting down and writing something and almost like, a heavenly vision of something from Hebrew or Greek that normal people can't attain to or something. And that's like the actual process of writing review is so much different than that.
Hmm.
And in terms of having outside opinions and helps and insights, incredibly crucial to how the work is done. And it's honestly
Hmm.
incredibly humbling when you send your work to a
Yeah.
peer reviewer and they say, well, you totally missed this. It's a humbling process, which is part of what makes it valuable. But I'll tell you this, Dr. Vaillancourt, I did the same thing in my dissertation. I talked
Yeah.
in brief about David and Bathsheba in the initial draft, use the language of adultery. And then later I changed the language in the published form. And I became convinced as well because of features of the text, especially the fact that when Nathan in his parable goes to David, he
Yeah.
he says, you are the man. You are the man. There
Hmm.
is no indication at all of responsibility on the part of Bathsheba, as well as, and this is something that came up in a classroom setting in a high school, a Christian high school. I was teaching through this text, and a 17-year-old girl, no formal education, she said, Dr. Howe, I see this, and isn't it true that the fact that God later grafted Bathsheba into the kingly line, that David obviously had multiple wives, and any one of those wives could have been the bearer of the seed, isn't the fact that God chose her an indication of her exaltation in God's eyes?
Mm.
And it was something that I had just never considered. And I had another conversation again with another friend later on as I was telling him about the insights of this teenager. He said, have you ever thought about the trauma that she would have experienced knowing that her husband was killed? And even if she had not, it's a gap in the story. We don't know if she knew that David ordered it, but she's still incredibly vulnerable with the death of her husband, even on the other side of the story. And yet through all of this, almost in a similar way as you have Hannah, who's vulnerable and yet God exalts her. You have a similar storyline with Bathsheba. And so as we think about this, this is one of the reasons, listeners, this is raw. This isn't something we planned to talk about beforehand.
Hmm.
But as we think about this, Dr. Vaillancourt, this is one of the reasons I find the Old Testament so compelling. You would have today politicians or kings who would pay millions of dollars to have this kind of story just totally trashed. This is the kind of thing that if you wanted it to be squashed and you would do it. And yet our God says, hey, the ideal king that I raised up and I chose is a king whose flaws and failures I am going to expose publicly to proclaim my glory, to proclaim my grace, but also to show that I am the God who forgives these offenses. And yet I'm the God who will take all of the good, still use it for good, be honest about the evil, and yet work that in such a way that Bathsheba is, in one sense, redeemed and exalted. So I loved your honesty. I so appreciate that, Dr. Vaillancourt, and what an opportunity for us to give sort of a behind the scenes look at your work. And so thank you so much.